Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Midweek Roundup, we're going to be covering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last few days. And as we do each week, for those of you who are new, we take our questions that we answer here on the Roundup from our newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern. That newsletter, called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, is in your inboxes at 9 a.m. Eastern if you're subscribing through our website, and that is smieconsulting.org/subscribe. You'll be able to subscribe directly to our newsletter there. Alternately, if you are a heavy LinkedIn user, you can get the LinkedIn version of that newsletter direct to your LinkedIn feed Mondays at about 8:30 a.m., so about a half hour before the website folks get theirs in their inbox. So very easy to do, subscribe, and we cover both social media and international education news stories, and oftentimes where those overlap in the newsletter, and focus primarily on the international ed stories for the Midweek Roundup here on Wednesday afternoons. And again, we're live on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, and on LinkedIn. So we're really grateful that you're with us for this journey this week as we cover 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last few days. First question of the day: is U.S. higher education viewed globally as influential as it used to be? And this is a question that I often get asked in conversation with particularly folks that are newer to the profession or from parts of the world where they have only become active on the international stage on the university levels in recent years. And the challenge with answering this question is the easy answer is to say, well, it's influential, certainly. Is it as influential? Perhaps not as much. And is that a bad thing necessarily? And I will say no to that. Not a bad thing necessarily that we're less influential. And the question of why this question is getting asked is there are a couple of news stories this week that feed into this narrative that, well, the U.S. is in decline and it isn't taken as seriously as it was anymore, that other universities in other countries are becoming more influential and more recognized and in the rankings and all of these wonderful things. And there's going to be truth to that in just the reality of rankings and the reality of how those institutions are geared to not just rank the same old folks at the top every year, and there's jockeying for position, and we see that internally in the United States. So with U.S. News and World Report, there's always scandals going on about people who fudge their numbers and how that's impacted in a vain attempt to impact their institution's rankings. People have lost their jobs. People have gone to jail for doing things like that. And rankings are an unfortunate reality in higher education, both in the United States and in the world. And as you see, there are many different ranking organizations out there. You've got obviously the U.S. side with U.S. News, but you've got Times Higher Ed, you've got QS, you've got Shanghai Rankings, and even within each of those groups, those organizations, they have different levels of rankings that they put out. New impact rankings, or most impact rankings, and new age and university rankings, and regional, kind of like what the U.S. does with the U.S. News. They have the best national institutions, then best national liberal arts, then regional liberal arts, regional state universities. So there's all sorts of subcategories that you can break these rankings out into. But the big ones are what the universities around the world compete for, higher rankings. And when answering this kind of a question, you look at, is the U.S. higher education viewed globally as influential as it once was? And part of that is the question of, are we losing our preeminence? And that was an Inside Higher Ed article this past week that had a lot of interesting kind of meandered around for a bit, but it started with a variety of clickbait kind of titles and headlines that you hear that oftentimes are part of what gets eyeballs on articles or rankings or whatever it may be. But one of his point in the article was that some of the reasons why, and this was an article saying that the U.S. is losing its touch necessarily in the world. It's not as influential, and part of that is he says some myths that aren't wholly wrong. That, for example, a college education doesn't guarantee a middle-class standard of living. A college degree doesn't necessarily certify learning. Students from low-income backgrounds are right to worry about college's return on investment. So that is really, I think, that those are things in the United States. Certainly, we've seen cracks in those myths. That perhaps there is some truth to those. He talks about when he talks about extending that internationally, the myth of U.S. research universities are undeniably the best in the world, and that he says the reality is universities or U.S. universities are struggling to maintain their preeminence in face of mounting foreign competition. And that competition is, I think, at the heart of what we're talking about today with regard to myths. He also, that's the main myth that he's talking about. He talks about how economies have changed over the years and how that impacts nation states, and how graduate programs that have been top are now losing pace in some areas. One reason he points to is a recent essay in Forbes pointed out that 3/4 of the 335 U.S. universities in the global top 2,000 have seen their rankings decline. And that's okay. And I will say that, again, it's okay that U.S. institutions' rankings aren't as high as they once were. And why is that? I have the same reasoning here in my response that I also give to people when they say, "Oh, the U.S. is losing its market share, and the international student race, and just not as competitive as we used to be." And the reason why, in answering both questions, for why rankings are slipping for some top U.S. research universities and why U.S. is losing market share, is it's a more competitive marketplace than it once was. And that we were at one point, it was the U.S., the Brits, and the Aussies that were the only ones who cared about rankings. And we dominated, all three of those countries dominated the top lists of university rankings worldwide. U.S. still does dominate, and 8 of the top 10 are still U.S. institutions. When you go further down, you might not see as many as you might once have seen, but you see also in these stories that we're seeing today, covering today, about why the U.S. is losing preeminence. You see, since let's just say since 2000, the United States had a little over 500,000 international students in the year 2000 that were attending its universities. Since 2000, our numbers have doubled. We were been over 1 million since 2018 even. So a little dip because of COVID and the pandemic in terms of enrolled students in the U.S. But overall, the SEVIS by the numbers reports still reflect over 1 million students from outside the United States studying in the U.S. No other country has more than 600,000 right now. So for the longest time, the UK has been in number 2 and is in a solid number 2 position again. And they were at about 500,000 themselves in the last few years, and they bumped it up to 600,000 during the pandemic. They've been particularly good and lucky in terms of the political dynamics in other countries, other destination markets that have not led to return of students. They've benefited greatly from what's happened during the pandemic in terms of enrollments. So the competition for international students has grown as institutions around the world see international students as primarily a financial boost to their institutions, but also the obvious cultural and demographic benefits that brings to your domestic students by exposing them to students from all over the world and helping them prepare themselves for the world outside academia. And that competition only drives people to be better, and not everybody can be the best, and that's clear. But there's going to be give and take in these rankings, depending on how much weight individual institutions put on them in terms of how much they're going to be increasing their research dollars that they're trying to bring in, or trying to match their or impact certain ranking categories to improve their status. So the same goes for enrollments of international students. You look at what's happened. You see in that, say, since the late 90s, when the U.S. had close to a third of all international students that were studying outside their country were coming to the U.S. back in the 90s. That number is down to 20% these days. So in that 25 year period, you've seen a decline in the overall market share, the pie, the global student mobility pie. The U.S.'s share has gone down from close to a third to only a fifth. And people are worried. But the reality is our numbers have doubled in that time as well, more than doubled in that 25 year period. So you see what happens doesn't mean you're less of a quality destination, that your institutions are less attractive, or to be honest, though, the U.S. is still going to be the number one country for the foreseeable future because of its quality institutions across the board. And we have so many more of them than any other country in terms of quality institutions that have history, that have longevity, that have quality reputations and quality programs, and dominate rankings across the world. Yes, we're going to not always be the top 10 or top 5 in every category, but we see in many categories the U.S. is as its reputation may have taken certain hits politically over the years, our institutions have largely sustain themselves in terms of their overall quality. And competition isn't a bad thing. I mean, frankly, it helps drive some institutions onto greater heights. It's certainly for countries that are coordinated in their approach to international education. You've seen great strides being made in Canada in the last 10 years, last 5 years especially, becoming a much more open and welcoming place for immigrants, and that translates to students in classrooms from overseas, when there are clear paths to citizenship and permanent residency, and to work, especially work. And that drives interest no matter where you are in the world. If you're looking to study outside your home country, you want to make sure that your experience is going to be a worthwhile one, that it's going to have a return on investment for you, and that it's going to lead you to a career in a place at a level that is where you think you should be. And that's what higher education is meant to do, and particularly international higher ed. You have dreams of millions of students every year being fulfilled or crushed, depending on their choices and where they go and the experiences they have. So, what I see in answering this question, particularly from this article in Inside Higher Ed, is that yes, it's not as influential as it once was because it's a multilateral world now, and it's not or a bipolar world. It was a bipolar world at one point. The U.S. versus Soviet Union when they collapsed, and others filled the vacuum. As the U.S. for a long time was the predominant, it has been the predominant economy, and then with the rise of China, and BRICS countries coming in together and acting together, you see changes in dynamics, and that's only natural. But in terms of the top rankings, yes, there have been slippages. The reality is, though, that's okay. More quality institutions across the board raises the stakes for everybody and raises the competition level, and that's not a bad thing. So the other part of this question it will answer in the second area, or second question of the day, and that is, how should you approach new student markets? The other side of that question is when one of the reasons potentially the U.S. is not as dominant as it once was is it has become over-focused on two markets, India and China in particular, which account for basically 50% of all international students in the United States. In some countries, those two nationalities represent 65 to 70%. But that's the point, I think, is it's not just the U.S. It's actually most of the top destination markets for international students. China and India are the two countries that will lead the way. Now, when you talk about new markets, we know in the U.S., and anyone who's been in international admissions for more than a minute already knows that fact. India and China dominate U.S. International student numbers. But what is also important to know is, and everyone knows once you've been in it for a minute, is you need to diversify where your students are coming from. The problem is there is no one other country, and nor should there be just one other country that's going to be the next India or the next China. The sheer demographics will tell you that, is that the populations around the world of the top countries are not there yet. We've seen evolutions in the Chinese student populations coming to the United States. We've seen that go from almost exclusively graduate in the 90s and early 2000s into now more undergraduates than graduate students in the United States from China, even though the undergrad numbers have been dropping over the last 4 or 5 years. But you see in India used to be almost exclusively grad. Undergrad numbers have been starting to rise, not at the sheer scale that the Chinese undergraduate numbers were rising, but you're going to see more Indian undergraduates looking at the United States. And undergraduates, either direct entry from high school or transfers as more dual degrees or twinning programs or 2+2s or 2+1+1s pop up on the radar. So in India in particular, as that country begins to open up more to international education and itself wanting to become a destination. But one of the key questions that I think a lot of institutions, when I'm working with them trying to develop, okay, where should we be going that we aren't now? Or where should we be recruiting or focusing attention that we're not doing right now? I always look, there's a balance, right? You do need to know where the students are. In terms of numbers, the numbers that are coming to the United States. There's kind of layers. You need to know first what countries are sending the most students outside their home country to begin with. Then you can get that from Project Atlas and other country data like that. Then you look at, okay, where are the students coming from to the United States, and where are some countries that maybe are coming in numbers that we're not getting our share of. Then you also look institutionally, where have our international students come? And if they have been from just China and India, then yeah, that's your flashing red sign saying diversify, diversify. Because if you don't, then all your eggs are in one or two baskets, and that's a dangerous thing internationally for an institution. Had the pleasure of working at an institution where they had probably 15% international students, but 80% of those students, the international students they had, were from 3 countries. And within the first year of being at that institution, all 3 of those markets collapsed nearly completely. One, because the scholarship program got rolled away, taken away for students eligible to come to our institution. And in 2 other countries, English language and non-immigrant intent were not met in the eyes of the consular officers after some transfer outs and some bad history there, and those 2 markets collapsed, and that led to significant enrollment declines that we had no control over, basically, in terms of what was going on at the time. But for institutions that have significant numbers and you can have 1 or 2 that are 20%, maybe even 30% if you're pushing it, but of your international students. But you want to have a good supply of other countries that are represented in your top 10 that are more than double digits if you're a smaller institution, or into the hundreds if you're more than 2 countries that are in double digits if you're a 20,000 student institution. So you really want to look at diversifying as much as possible. How you do that is really the trick. And our colleagues over at INTED make the point that when you're entering into new markets, one of the challenges that most institutions have is figuring out what your benchmarks are going to be. What do you really need to do year 1? What's possible year 2? And where should you be moving in the longer term? And knowing that when you enter a new market, it's not going to be, hey, we're here, come and join us, and in the next year you have 50 new students from that country. That's not a reality that most institutions have. Frankly, you need to work for it. And in order to do that, you really need to be thinking longer term about investment in a market, what that looks like, how messaging needs to be different for from market to market, doing a market analysis on what sells in a particular market. Part of that is knowing, hey, where are the skills shortages in those countries that you're going into that are perhaps, and you have programs that would match some of those needs that they have. For students that might be looking to go home after they're done. For those that might be looking to stay, you're looking about, okay, what are programs that we have that they might be interested in, that we know in the U.S., they're going to be good likelihood of opportunities for significant job prospects for those students at our institution when they graduate. So part of it is just knowing where to start and setting those, as our INTED friends call it, the benchmarks, and monitoring your progress in a new market. It's everything from and identifying first off what your key performance indicators are going to be in each market at certain times during your evolution of your relationship with that country. It's how are you getting into that market? Is it in-country companies and agencies you're working with? Is it social media campaigns and social listening that you're doing? Is it country-specific website microsites that you might be putting in place, like for China, if you're going to be truly efficient in the Chinese market, having local language content, locally hosted content? That's an important piece. Understanding what your email conversion rates, open rates are going to be, click-through rates are going to be, the downloads you're having, the attendance at events that you have virtually, in person, whatever it might be. Knowing your funnel and knowing how students should be coming through that from your overall perspective from your international admissions, but then trying to establish what would be some good benchmarks for that country. And so a great article that from INTED that's in the newsletter this week, and I certainly encourage you to check that out. And not to ignore those things, those bigger picture questions as you market to students, particularly in new markets that you're entering into, is understanding what their needs are. Why they're looking out to come to the U.S. Are there more push factors or pull factors that are sending them overseas for study? Is it labor? There's no places in higher ed, enough quality places at quality institutions in higher education in their home country that are looking overseas, or is it because surely they have money, they have talents, they want to explore other countries? That's important to know what those are. So I think knowing the skills, part of that, again, knowing your markets is knowing the skills gaps that exist in those home countries, and understanding you can get a lot of that data actually from U.S. Commercial Service for U.S. institutions looking to go work in particular markets. You obviously can get that fairly easily to know what those skills gaps are here in the United States. There's a great ISIF Monitor article on that very fact. Knowing where what fields are going to be the most in demand in the coming years, and knowing that healthcare in the U.S. is an area that there is huge demand for qualified candidates, that there aren't enough to fill right now. So you see a lot of really great resources. I think it's important to get your hands on and not just look and say, oh, I haven't been there yet, I want to go to that country, or look at the greater, look at a map, throw a dart into a map and see where it lands, and there you go, or pin the tail on the country. You don't want to be taking that random approach. You need to be data driven in terms of why you go where you want to go, and you should be able to back that up. And certainly when you have to argue for funds to recruit in a new country that you haven't been to before, how are you going to do that if you don't have the data to back it up? And this is something that the INTED folks certainly make the case. I certainly have been preaching that since I've been doing consulting, even when I was on the institutional side. You got to have the data to back up your reasoning, in particular if you're going to be spending 6 figures on an international recruitment budget every year. That's something that you want to have nailed down and be confident in your rationale, and then be able to live and die with the consequences. So there's a lot involved in doing your research, doing your homework, setting up your benchmarks, and then making sure you're following through. Working with an institution that's taken on some new vendors to help drive interest, because they hadn't been active internationally in the past, and one of the things that was done, contracts were signed, and leads started to come in, but they didn't really have a process to get them into their systems. It was all manual. It was the comm flow wasn't really good. That they had to really focus attention on where they hadn't done before. They hadn't developed an international communication plan for students at the undergrad or grad levels. The need was there. The decision was made to sign a contract and not really be ready for it on the back end. You can send us all the leads you want, but the reality is we didn't know what we were going to do with them. So the issues are really being thorough with why you do what you do and who you choose to do business with, but also once you've made those decisions, have the necessary internal mechanisms in place to respond and to be timely in communicating with students and to have content that's relevant for them. That's all 101 stuff in international admissions and any type of marketing efforts, but this is especially keen when you're entering into a new market. Otherwise, that's wasted effort. So let's move on to our third and final question of the day, and that is China self-isolating to the detriment of its international education goals? And for those of you who followed the Roundup for a while, you know we've been talking about China and the soft power initiatives they've been rolling out through the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, in South and East Asia, through to Africa, and even into Europe these days, that are planned specifically to raise China's level of prominence with countries around the world through financial investments in infrastructure, in universities, in schools, and all these other high import, high value topics, transportation as well. And you see one of those goals has been to increase China's reputation as a destination for international students. And we've seen in 20 years ago when we looked at the top receiving students, top countries, destination markets for international students, China wasn't even in the top 20. As of pre-pandemic, they were up to number 3 and pushing the UK hard for number 2. But they've fallen away now because of the pandemic, though they haven't released new international student numbers since 2019. You see what's happened in China. We've seen a lot of things develop over the last year. Last summer, we saw new laws that were put in place that were designed to really remove outside influence on its population, where the tutoring industry that had grown up significantly was severely curtailed, that the government put the halts and halt on a lot of businesses that were basically, in their eyes, too profitable. And the tutoring industry was one of those. A lot of prominent businesses, Alibaba and others, have lost significant revenue as a result of government policy changes. On the tutoring side, education side, you see places like New Oriental, largest single international education company in China, with tutoring and agents and all sorts of educational programs. They laid off, I think it was 16,000 people at one point. From their and closed a number of outlets across the country. You've seen tutors that were teaching English to Chinese students as young as 5 years old up through teenage years, tutoring them English virtually. Unless after the law was changed last summer, unless you were physically in China, where you could be a little bit more under their control. You couldn't do that anymore. You couldn't teach English to Chinese students if you were not living in China. So China's been certainly pulling back. We've certainly seen during the pandemic how much they've pulled back and how they are still, as most of the rest of the world is opened back up and international trade is flowing regularly again, or as regular as it can be with supply chain issues. You've seen travel being a lot easier, but not in China, or coming out of China, or getting into China. There's still a 2-week quarantine required for anyone, citizen or not, that goes into China. that's at your own cost. And if you've followed any of the news with the Shanghai lockdowns and what those have looked like for more than a month, 6 weeks to almost 2 months now, those have been horror stories about what you're hearing about conditions there. You've seen international schools; international teachers have been evacuated from the country. Other students have tried to leave from universities, but haven't been able to. They haven't been let out. So there's real challenges. There have been for some reason, there have been students who have been trying to get back in because they want to finish their degrees. That's the reason. From India, from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, from all over South and East Asia and Africa, have been trying to get back into China to continue their studies. They've been shut out. Only now there are small groups of maybe 200 at a time. And when you're talking about a country like India, they had 20,000 students studying in China before the pandemic that are trying to get back in. 100, 200 at a time. It's going to take forever for them to get back in. For Sri Lanka, same thing. They've got Pakistan has 7,000. They're only going to be let in 200 at a time. So we're talking about some real and who knows what you're going to be getting into if you do go back right now, because that country, that zero COVID tolerance policy, is having significant negative impacts. And it's even impacting not just the international students that are already there, it's impacting Chinese students that are now going, well, I don't want to go to university here in China now if the country's still going to be doing this crazy lockdown schedule and taking that mindset when all the rest of the world is opening up. I want to get out of here. I'm going to go overseas. So there are now going to be a whole group of Chinese students that certainly have been exploring the option, whether they actually go through with it or not. They've been exploring since these extra severe lockdowns have been happening, whether they want to go overseas. So China is not doing itself any favors right now when it comes to international education. Certainly it's damaging its economy almost irrevocably, the way it's shut down certain industries in certain cities, and that's affecting global supply chain as well. And the realities on the ground really don't reflect in China what's happening in the rest of the world. And that's to their detriment, unfortunately. The Nafsa Conference coming up in Denver in a couple weeks, there's usually there are 10,000 people, 10,000 people pre-pandemic that would come to this event. They're only going to be pulling about 6,000 right now. They're still under 6,000 registrants, and very few from China, if at any, when they might have 1,000 coming from China in the past, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe, and that's probably because they have residences outside that are actually coming to the conference this year. I don't know if there'll be a China pavilion. I don't think so. But there's some really interesting developments in China that are really hurting them in the long run when it comes to their international reputation. So not quite as bad as Russia, but certainly it's getting there, and they're doing some significant damage. But we'll see how long that will continue. That's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. We really appreciate you joining us and being a part of the conversation. We'll be getting the links to that were talked about in all these stories here today. We'll be putting those up on the Facebook and LinkedIn pages related to this site, to this live chat. So until next time, we wish you the very best and have a great day.